let me introduce our speaker today, wherever you may be. Our speaker is Dr. Sahar Izadi, who received a master's degree in Marine Mammal Science from the University of St. Andrews, and subsequently she did a PhD from the University of Auckland, where she happens to reside now in Auckland. Her PhD focused on the behavioral ecology of Brydes whales in New Zealand, and that will be the subject of her presentation, and it also was one of her papers published on her thesis and published in Marine Mammal Science. Well, she's currently not professionally working in marine mammal science, having co-founded a tech company. She is still working on papers following from her thesis, and she says she hopes to be back to working in marine mammal science full time in the future. So her presentation today will be about Brydes whales, one of 3 species of baleen whales that are non-migratory. Dr. Izadi will present her studies on the behavioral ecology of a small population of this species in the Hauraki Gulf of New Zealand. And in particular, she'll be presenting data on their foraging behavior that was collected using archival tags, boat-based surveys, and drones. Presentation is based on a paper of the same title as her talk, Feeding Tactics of Resident Brydes Whales in New Zealand. The paper is currently in early view. It hasn't yet been assigned to an issue. It likely will be the next issue that it gets assigned to. It's an open access paper, so it should be available to all at any point. Her co-authors are Natasha Aguilar de Soto, Rochelle Constantine, and Mark Johnson. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Sahar.
Thank you so much, Daryl. So I start sharing my screen. Please let me know if it doesn't work. Did it work? You're mute.
Don't see the screen yet.
Yeah, okay, cool. Okay.
Okay, there you go.
Awesome. So hello everyone, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Greetings from rainy Auckland. My name is Sahar, and I'm delighted to present our paper on behalf of my co-authors. Our paper is titled Feeding Tactics of Resident Brydes whales in New Zealand and was a part of my PhD, as it was mentioned before. We are thankful for this opportunity to be able to talk about this cool project to the broader community. So, Brydes whales. Well, they're one of the least known species of baleen whales. They're not as flashy and as iconic as blue whales or humpback whales, and they were not heavily exploited by commercial whaling. And their taxonomic status is under question, and they're often mistaken for other species. So their real distribution, behavior, and conservation status is not certain. What we know is that some populations of Brydes whales are critically endangered, like the ones in New Zealand. Some are not, and that they can be seen both in coastal waters and offshore waters in warm temperate oceans. They do not perform the larger scale migrations between the poles and the tropics, but stay within the temperate and tropical waters. And like all other roll claws, they launch feed. They have a broad diet of pelagic and mesopelagic fish, and they also feed on zooplankton and invertebrates like squid, crows, and it varies by location what they eat. In the Hauraki Gulf, they usually feed alone, not in groups of whales, just one whale, and then they can be accompanied by other species, but they're not accompanied by other Brydes whales, unless it's a modern calf pair. Our study happened in the Hauraki Gulf. So if you look at the right bottom corner of the map, this little red circle, which if I zoom in, that's the Hauraki Gulf, and it's quite shallow. It's the maximum depth is around 60 meters, and there's a year-round population of Brydes whales in the inner Gulf. Well, they were in the inner Gulf. They're now moving towards the outer Gulf, and they are 135 individuals, and they're categorized as nationally critical species in New Zealand waters. So the goal of this study was to look at foraging behaviors of Brydes whales and understand their different tactics, if they have any, to capture their food. We collected data with different methods, which all complemented each other. We used data collected by DTAG version 2. This is the DTAG. DTAGs are non-invasive sound and movement tags, and they're attached to the animal using suction cups. And they have multiple sensors such as depth sensor, temperature sensor, accelerometer, magnetometer, and they also record the sound. Tagging Brydes whales, which are very evasive and very unpredictable, needs really, really good experience and high level of patience. DTAGs were deployed in 2011 by a very, very experienced crew. In fact, my co-authors, Mark and Natasha, flew to New Zealand to contribute in the tagging process. However, the team only could tag 6 whales, which resulted in 61 hours of data. For different analysis, we could not use all the tag data because some data were noisy or they had technical problems. So we kind of tried to complement that with visual observation data. We conducted 140 visual observation surveys using Platform of Opportunity, Auckland Whale and Dolphin Safari, which you can see the photo here. It's a whale watching boat. And we also used University of Auckland research vessel and collected 630 hours of data. We also used phantom drones towards the end of the data collection, which by that time it was relatively new technology. We're talking about 2016, 2017, and we used them in 4 opportunistic missions. The DTAG sample size, as I mentioned, was small, but we were able to complement the data by our hours and hours of visual observation data. I won't get too much in details about the methodology as it's available in the paper and it's also quite boring. But in a very short summary, visual observation data were used to differentiate prey type and lunge type. DTAG data were used to detect lunges. We looked at dive properties and such as dive shape and dive depth. And we also used acceleration rate, which is called jerk, to detect lunges. And then we used flow noise as a proxy of speed or roll to confirm the detected lunges. When lunges were detected, then we looked at some other properties of the whale movement, such as low, mid, and high frequency components of the accelerometer to be able to detect sequence of events. We also looked at dead recon tracks and residence index. Residence index shows how tortuous the track is, and dead recon tracks estimate the movement patterns of the whales. Dead recon tracks cannot tell where the whale is going or how far they're traveling, but they can give us an idea of how they're moving. So the tag data showed that our Brydes whales fed both at the surface and in the water columns, but mostly at the surface. 84% of the detected lunges happened at the surface. Surface lunges are very similar in many aspects. They're very stereotypical regardless of prey type. They always include a roll, which was lateralized to the right. And so here are consecutive lunges in the feeding bout. There are 13 lunges. And in the second panel, you can see the roll. And the third panel is the jerk, which spikes whenever a lunge is happening. And the fourth panel is residence index, which also increases when the launch happens. And these are, from left to right, fluke strokes, roll, and flow noise patterns. And for all the surface launches of one whale, and the dotted line is time zero, which was the last peak in the jerk. So you can see that almost all of the launches follow the same pattern. The low, mid, and high frequency components of the accelerometer data showed the same pattern as a visual observation. And as you can see in this picture, tag data could show that exactly the same sequence of events that we observed on the boat or on the drone. So it was strong fluking, and then the roll, and then the mouth open. By the way, I just found a typo in here. So this is high frequency accelerometer data. It's a typo, it's mid frequency. So one of the things that we noticed when observing the Herky Gulf Brydes whales was the difference between their feeding tactics when they feed on plankton versus times they feed on fish. I'm not sure how the video looks like, but I apologize if it's laggy. Zoom doesn't like videos. So these are events that the whale is feeding on fish. When feeding on fish, they forage with other species. In fact, they take advantage of prey bowls prepared by dolphins, hard work, which I think it's visible in the footage if you could see the video. So they swim very fast from deeper waters towards the surface and take a gulp and then leave the scene, and which leaves the dolphins very disappointed. And when they're feeding on fish, they're accompanied by dolphins and also gannets and predatory fish. When we saw them feeding on zooplankton, when we observed them feeding, they were 91% of the occasions they were feeding on zooplankton. And when feeding on zooplanktons, they were feeding on their own. They were not accompanied by other species. There were occasionally birds around, but it was not a multi-species aggregation. And again, I hope this video is playing properly because Zoom and video, but a similar footage is provided as supplementary material of the paper. You can see that in this footage, they swim more slowly. They launch when we were watching them launching on zooplankton, they were launching for several hours. And you could even see them in the same place for a couple of days. Prey was sometimes visible at the surface, and we could observe that what the species it was. And we could see that there were like krill-like crustaceans, and in multiple occasions, surprisingly, salps. It's very interesting because salps are almost like flavored water. They're very just watery. And sometimes we saw in the drone footage that, and I think you could notice it here if I would fast forward the video, that the whales, when they were feeding on plankton, they were moving in circles. As I mentioned earlier, we used DTAG data to dead reckon the whale tracks, which confirmed these circular movement patterns. So here is a dead reckon track of one whale. Pink or purple is resting and blue is active. I'll explain more about active and inactive phases in a few minutes. This whale was actively feeding at the surface during the day, and we believe it was feeding on plankton. And this small red dot here is a feeding bout, meaning several consecutive lunges. And if you zoom in, we see loops. And these color parts are lunges. This whale was moving in loops while feeding. This is while the other whale, which we observed before tagging, it was feeding on fish and performed a couple of subsurface lunges after tagging, and does not move in loops. And this is quite interesting. Excuse me. The question is why? Is there a specific reason for these whales to move in circles while feeding on planktons? Well, we think the whales might use the microcurrents or create their own microcurrents when feeding on planktons, but we cannot be sure. But if that's true, this is not exactly tool using, but could be some sort of environmental manipulation. One very interesting thing that we could see using tag data was that our British whales show dial patterns in their activities. So after sunset, their dial shapes change. You can see it here, like a little, like less than an hour after sunset. The dials become shallower and they change shape. Also, their respiration rate and fluking rate drops, meaning that they are less active and are in a resting mode. We know that some cetaceans show dial patterns, and some of them probably rest. For British whales, this can be due to their reliability on sensors, which are dependent on light levels, such as vision, or it could be changes in availability of prey that makes the nighttime foraging not really worth it. The hierarchy gulf is too shallow for significant zooplankton vertical migration, but it is possible that some prey species of British whales have these dial patterns. Other British whales also show some sort of dial patterns. For example, in the Gulf of California, the whales feed more often at dawn and dusk, when the fish schools are less likely to detect the predators. And in Madeira, whales' dial pattern follow the dial pattern of zooplanktons. But there's no study to show if the rest is happening or not. This finding is quite important. The occurrence and rest can affect the level of responsiveness and consciousness of the whales, and that makes them more vulnerable when they're resting to the anthropogenic impacts, such as ship strikes or entanglement. Ship strikes were previously a big concern in the hierarchy Gulf for this population, but at the moment it's not because of the implementing of some rules to decrease the speed of the vessels. One particular behavior that made launch feeding of on plankton different from feeding on fish was a behavior that we called headstops. Again, videos, I hope you can see them. In the head slapping behavior, the whale brings out its head. Excuse me, I don't know why I'm coughing. The whale brings out its head out of the water with an average angle of 45 degrees and then hit the water surface 1 to 7 times. They've been observed to do this in the hierarchy Gulf for decades. We're not the first people who saw this. And is exclusively performed by this population of British whales, not any other British whales. And we think it's a very unique behavior. The reason is that other marine predators do some similar things like this. They slap the water with their head or their flukes, but they do that to stun the prey. This is while the hierarchy Gulf British whales do it on the zooplankton. So zooplanktons are not that active and they do not need to be stunned. So if it's not to manipulate the prey itself, why do they do this energetic, expensive behavior? That was our question, and with the help of Dr. Alex Worth, we were able to look into the physics of this behavior and how it influences the water. Alex visited New Zealand, I think it was in 2017. And then he went back home and ran some experiments in his lab, which gave us the opportunity to look at the data and have a good idea of what is going on. We believe using the water surface and their head, whales manipulate the environment to aggregate the prey. These movements create cavities and vortices, which creates low pressure areas. With alternating push and pull effect, they increase the concentration of the prey 3 to 5 times. And you can also see in the video the water turbulence around the whale's head when the whale is doing that. We observed the mother and calf pairs feeding on zooplanktons doing head slaps. In that case, the mother performed the head slaps and the calf did the launch feeding through the aggregated prey. Brydes whales seem to be masters in finding fascinating techniques to maximize their prey intake. So these are Brydes whales in the Gulf of Thailand. And I found this video on Reddit, and I thought it was one of the best videos out there showing the behavior. This is called passive thread water feeding. And Iwata et al. Studied that, and they realized that it is an static ambush technique. The waters in upper Gulf of Thailand are low in oxygen. So the fishes limited to the surface to be able to take in oxygen. And these whales take advantage of this environmental feature in the fish behavior, and they move their fluke under the water and open their mouth and wait, and the fish jump into their mouth. So it's pretty interesting. As I mentioned before, Brydes whales of the Hauraki Gulf have a very variable diet, feeding on both fish and zooplankton, such as copepods, arrowworms, and surprisingly, saps. Based on a study by Carroll et al. In 2019, they seem to prefer zooplankton, and we have seen them feeding on saps in multiple encounters. And Carroll et al. Also showed that they quite like saps, and it is included in their diet frequently. How Brydes whales survive on a poor energy diet might be related to their lower energetic needs compared to many other whale claws, because they do not undertake seasonal migration, and they do not do like fasting like crazy and eating like crazy. So we think that might be the reason they are able to manage it. And so they are able to meet their needs all year in the Hauraki Gulf due to the diet plasticity. They basically eat what is available. They don't eat everything, and they have the preferences, but they're not limited to one prey type. And they also bulk feed. They also do use different bulk feeding tactics when they're feeding on different prey. And they know how to manipulate their environment to make most of their food and increase their prey intake. Brydes whales are very adaptable species with flexible behavior. As you saw, they use head slaps in the Hauraki Gulf and then thread water feeding in Gulf of Thailand. And other Brydes whales around the world use other tactics, like they launch feeding groups for fish in the Gulf of California, or, for example, they forage in multi-species aggregation in South Africa. Even in the Hauraki Gulf, they have shown a change in diet in less than a decade. Like 10 years ago, they were mostly feeding on fish, but now studies show that they prefer zooplanktons. And we have, I think more than 80% of the occasions that we saw them, they were feeding on zooplankton. They also have recently moved to the outer Gulf in response to their prey density, which we think is because of climate change. So they are very adaptable and they change their diet and behavior if needed. But that change can indicate that there is a change in the environment. And unfortunately, not all species are as flexible as these whales. And there might be time that the changes are so big that even these whales cannot survive. So we had a very evasive, not very interested in humans whale species, which affected our data collection despite the highly experienced team. But in spite of that, we were able to answer the questions we wanted with good team and good analysis and complementary visual observation data. And we were able to not only reveal their different foraging behavior, but also we were able to look at other interesting aspects of their life, such as rest, which we think all of these have, all the results of this study has applications in conservation, law enforcement, and understanding effects of climate change. This study was collaboration between multiple people from multiple countries. And it always takes a village to do these things. There were many people we're thankful to. We would like to especially thank Alex Worth, whose contribution was very valuable to us. Alex, if you're here, thank you. And thank you so much for listening to my talk. I know my talk is shorter than usual, and I'm not good at expanding talk, but I'm good at summarizing things. And I'm happy to take your questions. I'm not sure if my other co-author Rochelle is here. If she's here, she can contribute in question and answer. If not, it's just me. Well, thank you.
Sahar, thank you for that presentation. I don't know, Eric, if we have any questions lined up in the Q&A. It doesn't look like we do. So maybe I'll start with a question. Just looking at the videos, it seems like the two different tactics require quite different energy profiles. It looks like, to me, fish feeding should be a whole lot more costly energetically. Do you, first, I guess, do individuals have a particular tactic, or do they feed in both manners? And sort of secondly, then, is you know, do you have any ideas about the energetic costs and what might determine if an individual will feed on in both methods, to whether there's some threshold density, for example, that makes one tactic worth pursuing over the other?
Sure. So we could not determine which individual did what. We could follow one individual while we were observing it, and also we could look at their behavior through the tags. So when we were observing a whale, if it was feeding on plankton, it was feeding on plankton. If it was in an area with planktons, it was an area with fish. And when they were feeding on fish, it would happen like once or twice and they were gone. Like they were not staying in the area for a long time. But with planktons, they were like there for hours and hours. So we think, well, obviously fish is high nutritious. So maybe one or two lunges would suffice for whatever time, but feeding on planktons need more effort. Well, feeding on fishes is more speed, more energetic, but you're having a more nutritious food. But while, for example, you're feeding on saps, you need to do it hours and hours and hours and use the head slabs to collect more and have more. But unfortunately, we were not able to look at the individuals. We were able to detect one or two individuals based on the markings on their body and dorsal fins, but we couldn't match all of them to the catalog we had.
It's interesting that you seem to be suggesting that it actually is more costly to feed on plankton, zooplankton, than the fish, which is just the opposite of what I was thinking. Any idea on how you might go about looking at the energetics of the different tactics?
We did some calculations about salves that like I'm not specifically suggesting one is more than energetic than the other, but we've seen them that they've put lots of effort when they're feeding on plankton. You know, the head slap is like lots of movements. Of course, if we feed fish, feeding on fish is very quick and very fast and high energetic. But the one thing is that we don't see them feed on fish that often anymore in the Hauraki Gulf. So it's a bit difficult to say, but I think the best way would be just to calculate how much energy per gulp they can get from each feeding bout and see if, well, it should be, it should be enough. Like they would have been extinct by now if they couldn't survive by, it's been 10 years that they're mostly feeding on planktons and they've been like dead by now. But they, except for ship strikes, they seem to be doing pretty goodish. Like the population is doing a bit okay. They're very small, but it seems that they're doing okay with plankton. So it's a good thing to look at in the future, see how, calculate the energetic intake and see how it is useful. Because from what we see, it's, especially if you see the head slap behavior, it's just the whale is all over the place, like moving, gulping, and moving, gulping. So yeah, it's something to do a research in the future.
Okay, thank you. Eric, any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I have a question that came in here, and you might have answered it, but maybe a little broader work. This one's from Pachaporn Yawasuth. I apologize for the pronunciation. It says, what kind of fish do they feed on? I think you answered that they don't really feed on fish here, but maybe you can answer if that's different for different Brydes whales.
So they were not sure if I'm spelling them correctly, but sorry and pilchards, they were the fish species that they were feeding on, based on Carroll et al. Because they did a study on the stomach content of the Brydes whales and like the feces of the stomach content, and they categorized the prey type.
Great, thank you for that. And I had a question actually. So I wasn't sure if you addressed this before, but is there any, I know they're tracking like prey out in the ocean, but is there any stability to the conditions in these areas that would suggest that they're targeting certain regions repeatedly, or is this just, or do you suspect these are behaviors that just are triggered by finding the big fish? I'm just wondering, is there like any regularity to where the prey appear such that they've kind of learned to go to these specific areas and feed this way? Or is it more that they're employing this over a bigger scale and maybe it's something they've learned to do more broadly?
Well, in smaller scale, yes, like if we were going out on the Auckland Whale and Dolphin Safari and they had seen a whale in particular area the day before, we would have gone back there hoping to see the whales, and in many occasions we could see them. But 1 week after that, no. So I think they were all over the place, but if there was a good aggregation of prey somewhere, they would stay in the area, especially with the zooplankton. And they will stay there and take as much as they could, and then they move. But it wasn't like stay in, because Harki Gulf is small. It's not really itself. It's not very big. So it wasn't like staying in an area and then moving to another area. It's all a small area, you know.
Okay, interesting. So, I mean, in that vein, do you think is it partially that small area enables them to use, certain tactics better than others, that would make it why they do the head
Yeah.
slaps and the circling?
Yeah, of course, like the environmental factors are playing an important role. Like Harki Gulf is very shallow and it has its own features, and they're seen like in the Harki Gulf. So yeah, I think that the environment plays an important role in here. Like it's a good environment for them to stay all year.
It's really interesting. So, in following up just on one more, like if they're staying all year, and you mentioned a little bit before about the mother calf learning things, I'm just wondering, like, do they learn like regularly, between like, do you think individuals, there's a lot of individuals who've learned how to use these tactics in like a stable way, or are they moving around and going other areas too?
So with the mother and calf, well, the calf is obviously very small to do the head slap, so they don't have enough power. But we think it's they learn it from their mothers, because when the whales are feeding, there are not any other whales around, so it's just the mother and the calf, and it's a behavior that it's been in the area for decades. So they've you see people that we talk to people that they had seen the behavior like 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So it's we strongly believe that it's a culturally transmitted behavior. So we think that the calves learning from their mothers, and you don't see it in other British whales. Like these are just the only population that do that. But I'm not sure if the environment changes, if they have to move outer and move to the open ocean. I don't know if they keep doing this, but for now they're doing it. So yeah, I don't know if I answered your question though.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was thinking similar in the vein of like how small cetaceans develop very complex behavioral tactics for feeding when their spatial heterogeneity is kind of predictable and they're spending time in a small area over long times. It seems like, this is pretty good evidence that with certain similar environmental constraints, baleen whales can do, can kind of emerge with similar cultural phenomenon. That's really cool. Okay. Well, we don't have any more questions here. Daryl, if you have anything else, I'm just checking through the chat and Facebook.
Maybe I've got one more question, and I'm not sure if you said this and I missed it or not, but is it possible that the sort of circular swimming pattern is also part of concentrating prey? I know you said the head slapping helps in this regard, but do you think the circular swimming does as well?
Well, we think it might be, but we cannot be sure because we looked at they're very like tiny circles in general, like, compared to big currents in the ocean. So it's not there. We think they're not following the ocean currents, but they're doing their own thing maybe. But we cannot really be sure. But our guess is yes. But it needs more study and like more time to look at this behavior and look at the physics of it maybe. Yeah, but yeah, it could be.
And that only occurred with zooplankton. It didn't occur with fish feeding, did it?
We just saw it with zooplankton, yes. With the fish, like not like that. But the zooplankton, they were like circling the area for a long time. Yeah, and we could see it like first with the drone footage, and then we could we look at the tag data and so okay, we see it in the tag data as well.
Okay, great. Let's see, Eric. I guess we do have one more question that looks like it popped up.
Yep, I see it. Okay. This one is from Rashawadi Chantra. The question is, did you see any skin disease on British whales in New Zealand?
I haven't seen it myself, and I haven't heard of any diseases going around, but I didn't specifically look at the diseases, skin diseases. So from my observations, no, but it might be there. There might be there. Yeah.
All right. Well, that is it for questions, and yeah, I think I'm done. So Daryl.
I think
If you're
I've
done.
run out of questions. So I guess if we have no more questions from the audience, then we will thank you for your presentation. Thank you for publishing in Marine Mammal Science. And I hope you do get back to working on marine mammals in the future. Thank you very much, Sahar.
Thank you so much, Sahar. All right. So, Daryl, want to remind anybody of our next?
I'm not sure what our next one is. Do you know it?
Actually, we don't have our. Yep, that's right. We'll confirm the dates in the future. So look out for the next SMM Editor Select.
Okay, great.
All right, everyone.
Thank you much, and we'll see
Have
you
a great
next
day.
one. Bye-bye.